Tell us a little bit about spatial memory. Is that impaired in schizophrenia, and what's an example of what mistakes they make because of that?
Okay. I mean, one of the things that is impaired, not as much as some of the other abilities, is nonverbal memory functioning. People with schizophrenia actually are generally unimpaired in visual perceptual abilities. So they can tell you what the orientation of two lines is, right? They can say, oh yeah, that's a right angle. But if you show them this, and then this, and then this, they might not be able to remember which one was first or which one was second. So it's the same general process. The functional importance of that is if you have to navigate to get to work, and sometimes you have to navigate by taking different routes. If you live in a city where construction is constant and you need to take alternative routes, you need to be able to not only discover your way the first time, you need to remember those routes for later in case you run into the same kind of challenge. So spatial wayfinding is something that's important and is to some extent impaired in people with schizophrenia too.
What about remembering where things are in space, like in the house? What is that, the visual spatial memory, or what?
Some of the classic research on frontal lobe mediated memories shows that spatial working memory is very dependent on the frontal lobe. And spatial working memory involves remembering what the spatial orientation and location of items are, and the idea of developing a strategy to place things spatially is sort of at the interface between spatial working memory and executive functioning. So any kind of thing that gets you out the door in the morning on the way to work has probably involved attention, working memory, longer term memory, and problem solving. And the things do in fact link together. These domains are highly intercorrelated in people with schizophrenia. Although there are still some holdouts who would try to argue that schizophrenia is a frontal lobe condition, it's not. The level of impairment across these abilities is generally the same, which means that interventions, which we'll talk about later, could very well be targeted at any number of these abilities with a chance of success.
Okay. Phil, one of the common findings in patients with schizophrenia is lack of insight, anosognosia. They're not aware they're sick. They don't believe they're sick. They don't think they believe they need the medication. And that interferes with them getting care. Is lack of insight a cognitive deficit, or is it a negative symptom?
So that's a very important question. And this is one of the things I do most of my research on, is actually awareness. So let me take the chance to just describe this a little bit. Unawareness of illness was described back in the early days of the 1900s, where people with schizophrenia would deny that hallucinations and delusions could possibly be abnormal experiences. What's striking about that is if you take a person with schizophrenia and tell them that their roommate told them that they had a computer inserted in their brain, they will say that's preposterous. No one can have a computer in their brain. And then if you say to them, but wait, you told me yesterday that there was a radio transmitter in your brain. Isn't that implausible? The answer is no, that's my brain. So what happens is people with schizophrenia, lack of insight about symptoms involves suspending disbelief and being convinced that because it's your idea, you're correct, while having fully preserved knowledge of what is plausible in the real world or not. There was a famous study done back in the 1950s where they brought 3 people with schizophrenia who all thought they were Jesus Christ and put them in the same hospital ward in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And what they discovered was that all of these people sustained their belief that they were Christ and thought the other people were imposters. So obviously there is some cognitive process going on here. But it's also important to keep in mind that lack of insight also applies to cognitive abilities, functional abilities, and social abilities. So people with schizophrenia also misestimate their own cognitive abilities as well. So that they don't systematically overestimate or underestimate. On average, the correlation is 0, because some people overestimate and other people underestimate. The same thing applies for everyday functioning. Some people who've never worked a day in their life will tell you that they are better at work skills than people who are currently employed. So it's a wide-ranging phenomenon, and there are several important cognitive processes in that. it's also very stubborn. I can't tell you how many parents of people with schizophrenia I've talked to who just say, tell me what to do to get him to understand that he needs to take his medicine. Can you tell him to take his medicine and make him do that? And you as a psychiatrist have had that experience a million times, most likely.
Yeah, absolutely. So is that what we refer to as metacognition, the awareness? And is that in the frontal lobe as well?
In fact, we did a really interesting study where we looked at the certain frontal lobe regions and their response to these metacognitive challenges. What we did was we did a study using an MRI scanner, and we asked people, healthy people and people with schizophrenia, to do two things. In the first condition, we asked them to recognize the emotions that were in people's faces. But the second test was metacognitive. We asked them to concentrate exclusively on how convinced they were that they were right about the facial affect that they were seeing. And what we saw was that in healthy people, there was a correlation between a specific region in the frontal lobe and their correctness in terms of their certainty. The schizophrenia patients showed less of a relationship, but crucially, the activation in that brain region, the ability to be accurate in your confidence about your social judgments, was found to be correlated with real-world social functioning in that sample of people with schizophrenia. And we published that paper in your journal, Henry, a couple of years ago.
That's right. A very good paper, actually. All right, let's now switch to social cognition. You mentioned at the beginning that there's neurocognition, and we just discussed a lot of them, and there's social cognition, which can also be impairing. So kind of give us a quick overview of what are the social cognitive domains that are impaired in schizophrenia.
Just to give a little background, social cognition involves the ability to perform cognitively demanding but socially relevant tests. It turns out there is a correlation between social cognition and neurocognition, in that if you are very, very impaired in neurocognition, just about everything social cognitively is a challenge, but it's possible to have more intact neurocognition but still have impaired social cognition. That is recognizing emotions and being able to generate emotions yourself, right? So seeing a face, you'd say that person is angry. And if I asked you, can you show me a happy face on your face? Being able to do that yourself. The idea being able to understand what other people are thinking. Do they like you? Are they interested in you? Are you doing something that is possibly annoying them? Being able to tell what their response is. And finally, attributions. Figuring out why people do things. If someone bumps into you on the street, is it always on purpose? Were they trying to make you mad? That kind of thing is what's referred to as attribution. So we have emotion, we have what they call theory of mind, which is understanding other people's thoughts, and then attribution are the three big domains of social cognition.
Is that empathy? In a theory of mind, is that empathy? Patients with schizophrenia have difficulty putting themselves in somebody else's shoes?
That's exactly it. So theory of mind is the ability to understand what someone else would be thinking or feeling given their circumstance. So we often will show people scenarios and ask them, what is the person on the right thinking right now? Right? Show them a scenario where someone has just been mean to them and say, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? And why? And so that's really the test there. And so what's important about social cognition is that social cognition may be more important for social abilities and social outcomes than neurocognition, because it may turn out that if you're misperceiving people's affects or misinterpreting their thinking, it becomes very challenging to interact with them, and particularly if you combine that with lack of insight. So if you think you're better at social things than you actually are, you may choose to take on social interactions that you don't have much chance to succeed in. And so as a consequence there, you need the balance between being aware of your abilities and having them is critical for social outcomes.
Yeah, and the people notice social cognitive deficits more than neurocognitive deficits. I mean, social cognition is noticeable. And that's what kind of makes the patient stick out as something abnormal going on.
It's interesting because we have actually developed some rating scales so we can have relatives rate the social cognitive and neurocognitive abilities of their family members. And it turns out you're absolutely correct. Relatives are better able to rate social cognitive abilities than neurocognitive abilities, largely because relatives have social interactions with their family members and may not have an opportunity to see them engage using other cognitive skills. But social interactions, particularly the people that you are close to, whether you pick them, your roommates, or not, your family, are always ongoing and always important.